This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. One of Brian's charges is to expose the world to Walter Dean's artwork, and at local exhibitions and this video may help, but a website can expand that reach exponentially, and that's where Squarespace comes in. With the click of a button and a few minutes, Brian can create and launch a beautiful, mobile-friendly website that works everywhere. And as technology changes, Squarespace will update the platform so that he doesn't have to do any maintenance, ensuring that this isn't just a website, it's effectively an online museum. And aside from beautiful templates, Squarespace has tons of help tutorials, an online forum, and real-life people to help you if and when you get stuck. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Last time, I started and finished cleaning the painting, and no, you're not going to get to see it in time-lapse or anything else. I'm saving it for the end. Trust me, it's worth it. But before I can start putting this painting back together, I have to address some of these losses. And because the canvas is raw and there's that adhesive from the impregnation there, I need to put a ground layer to enable the fill-in medium to bond to something. If I try to do it directly on the canvas, I'll run the risk that it'll flake off. So I'm painting in all of those little areas, and it's tedious. And sometimes I'll have to go over it multiple times. But in the end, it's necessary. And once that's complete, I can then turn to my fill-in medium and start building up that texture, that impasto that was created by Dean's brushwork as he painted the painting. Simply applying this fill-in medium and smoothing it out won't work because there is a texture on this painting. And even though I make it the color matching right, the light's going to hit and show that it's a smooth surface. So I have to add texture, and I can do that with any number of tools. But I'll start with a simple fan bristle brush, and I'll drag it through that wet fill-in medium, using the areas around the losses as indications of where the brushwork was headed. And this gives me an instant brushwork texture. It's not perfect. I'll still need to come back later on and work it again, but you can see that with a couple of motions of the brush, well, now I have something that looks more accurate than a smooth surface. Once this is all dry, I can start removing all of the excess. It's always easier to remove the excess than it is to try to contain the application. It's just much faster. And using dampened cotton swabs, I will simply roll over and lift off some of this thin layer of fill-in medium. Now, this does also take a long time, but such is life. You listen to a good podcast or some good music and it flies by. Somewhat. It still takes a long time. In fact, it takes a couple of days of me going over and over and over, back and forth, multiple passes to make sure that I get all of that residue off. And then I can come back with little dental tools and I can start refining some of that fill-in. Because the fill-in is water-based and because I have to use little cotton swabs to remove the excess, sometimes the fill-in gets smoothed out and the brushwork that I tried so hard to create with the bristle brush is lost. So I can come back in with little dental tools and I can recreate it manually. And this is great because it allows me to refine that work. Whenever a painting has been through a catastrophic event, I always like to take the precautionary approach of adding a strip lining. Now, I don't want to line the whole painting to a new canvas because A, it doesn't need it, and that would be superfluous and excessive, and B, I don't want to lose any of this inscription that's on the back. In addition, the canvas is strong, it's just the tacking edges that I'm worried about, so I'm going to add a little piece of Belgian linen just to the tacking edges. I'll apply an adhesive film that gets ironed on, remove the release layer, and then I'll take this frayed Belgian linen and apply it to the back of the canvas. It's frayed for two reasons. One, to increase the surface area that the adhesive will bond to, and two, to create a softer edge so that we don't have a crisp line telegraphing to the front of the painting. After I apply the heat, I'll put a weight on to make sure that there's no distortion. I'll trim the excess off, get rid of the frays on the end, and proceed with the next layer. This is going to add a lot of fidelity to this painting when I stretch it. It's going to make sure that the painting doesn't tear at this tacking edge, that it doesn't pull through the canvas when there's tension on it. And it's going to make sure that in the future, if it ever needs to be keyed out or more tension added to the canvas, there is enough meat on the tacking edges that it will hold. Now, this can be removed with heat or solvent, but I'm not sure why it would need to be in the immediate future. Maybe in 100 years when there are different adhesives or techniques, maybe. Before I can stretch the painting back to its stretcher, I have to clean the stretcher. Normally just a little bit of water, wiping it down would be sufficient to remove the dust and dirt, but this was infected with mold, and so I'm using a mold and mildewicide to spray on this wood, and I'm going to let it sit and saturate. I don't want to heat this wood up because it could distort, but this will kill any of those spores that are remaining. It will also allow me to wipe it clean and make sure that the stretcher looks good. Mostly here we're concerned with health and safety, but getting the stretcher looking good is a nice bonus. With the stretcher now clean, I can reassemble it. And cleaning a stretcher is always a good opportunity to examine it to see if there are any areas of damage, something like rot or splitting. And luckily for us, this did not suffer any damage, so we can reuse it. And wherever possible, I like to reuse the original because it's original. And if I don't have to throw it away and replace it with something new, well, it saves on cost, it saves on time, and it keeps as much of the painting original as possible. And that's really important, even if it's just a stretcher. Sometimes there's writing on the stretcher. Sometimes the wood or the fabrication of the stretcher can tell us about when it was made, for whom, how, or things that we don't even yet know we might need to know. Now the stretching process, again, is really simple and straightforward. A couple of tacks in the center of each side keep the center of the painting taut, and then I work from the center out using my pulling pliers to add a little bit of tension and my magnetic hammer to drive in a tack every inch or so. I prefer to use tacks because I think they look nicer. They create one hole in the canvas as opposed to staples, which create two holes, and they're easy to remove in the future. I'll trim off the excess, which will enable me to fold in and tuck these corners, which I know I like to do because it looks good, but folding them in and tucking them also makes sure that they don't come loose and create a weak point in the stretching. You have to think of this as a whole process, and anytime you can add benefit, you can make something stronger, make it last longer, you really owe it to yourself and to the painting to do so. Now, once I have cleaned up the edges, I can start tacking the excess canvas to the stretcher. Some people like to cut this off. I see no reason to do that. It can be useful in the future. And also, I think it adds some level of support. The original keys were lost, so we cut some new ones out of poplar and drive them in to add a little bit of tension to the canvas. It's always easier to add tension with the keys than it is to overstretch the canvas. If you overstretch it, the tension can be uneven, but with the keys, you do get an even distribution. A little piece of fishing line through a hole drilled into that key and bound to a tack into the stretcher will make sure that this key will never be lost if it becomes loose. Whenever a painting has massive losses and requires tons of fill-in, it's really important to put down an isolation layer, a buffer layer, or a saturation layer, whatever you want to call it. This application of synthetic resin will do two things. One, it will enable me to see what the colors look like when they're fully saturated. Two, it will seal up all of that porous fill-in material so that my paint has something to stick to and doesn't just get sucked down. And three, because this had a lot of losses, it will fill in some of those little micro transitions where the fill-in didn't. And now we can get started on retouching. And this is a big project. I know it doesn't look it, but really it is. Now for the retouching, I'm going to be using synthetic conservation paints. Unlike oil paints, these don't have oil in them, and they're designed to be reversed with a solvent. They can be reactivated, so all that you see here on my messy looking palette, well, that's all good paint that I can use. Now what makes this so difficult is that it seems so easy. Right, this is a pink-ish, purple-ish, gray-ish, blue-ish color. Yeah, it's all of those things and none of those things. This was what was called a wet on wet technique, where the paint was wet as Dean mixed it. So he laid down some color, then came back with some more color and blended it on the canvas, which makes for a really beautiful painting technique. The problem for conservators doing retouching is that there are so many variations of color here that it's not so simple as mixing one and applying it and then everything is done, even though it looks like it's one color. It takes lots and lots of passes, making slight variations, making it a little bit cooler, a little bit warmer, a little bit darker, a little bit more red, a little bit more blue. You get the picture. And you have to go over it over and over and over again, taking a step back and seeing if it looks right, and then correcting where it doesn't. Now, on top of this, you have to mind the fact that there is impasto and brushwork here. So you can't simply just lay down color, ignoring the fact that the color may not match the stroke of the brush. So that has to be taken into account too. And you can see this is a relatively small area, maybe the size of a quarter or so, and I'm spending a lot of time working on it. This is how the entire painting will go, just slowly laboring. This is one of the things that is really great about retouching, that you really can get lost in color mixing and making something disappear. And when it is going well, man, it feels great. You kind of feel like you can do no wrong, that every color you mix is great. When it is not going well, it is so unbelievably frustrating. Why can't I simply mix this purplish, reddish, orangish, peachish, bluish, grayish color? And you want to smash your head against the wall. Those are the times when you have to walk away, you have to find another project, maybe actually smashing something like a broken stretcher, and regain your composure. Because working the problem is not going to solve it. It's just going to make you more frustrated. But if you've done this long enough, you know how to spot when things are going well and when things aren't. And even though I will need to make a second pass on just about all of the retouching, this is a good first start and one that I'm happy with. The application of retouching paints is this delicate balance of painting and correcting. You can't really paint. You're not allowed to paint. But in an area like this, where there's so much loss, the simple application of dots of color won't cut it. I mean, it's just not going to be effective. Number one, it would take forever. And number two, it's not actually going to achieve the desired result. Now, this is what is called mimetic retouching, where basically we are trying to mimic or recreate what was lost. Now, we don't know what was there, but we do have a good approximation because we can see the rest of the painting. There are other techniques of retouching whereby the conservator just tries to blend in or disguise the damage so that it's not so visually distracting. And it's really up to the client and the conservator to choose an approach that works for everybody. And in this case, Brian didn't want to see the damage. His family doesn't want to see this painting as a relic of Hurricane Ian. They want to see this painting as Walter Lofhouse Dean's prized piece. They want to see it as he imagined it. And that's why we've decided to recreate as much as we can. Now, in the sky, it seems relatively easy. It's just a bunch of colors mushed around and swirled about to create kind of an amorphous blob. But remember what I said about how many colors are involved in this and how the brushwork has to match? Well, I've done a lot with the impasto to make sure that the texture matches, but now I have to work on making sure the color flows and even some of that grime that's in the paint, that stuff that doesn't come out. Maybe it's old oil that's darkened, maybe it's old paint that's blended in there, who knows? But the cleaning process didn't remove it. So I have to account for that too. But ultimately, this can be really fun. Even though it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, you step back and you see a completed painting where there was once a ton of damage. And you know that those efforts, as painful or tiring as they may have been, were worth it, because it will enable somebody else to see this painting as the artist intended, not as it is now, as an artifact. And that's one of the really interesting things about conservation, is that we have to decide whether a painting is a piece of fine art, the work of an artist with a particular and unique vision, or it's a living, breathing object that has scars and age and wear, and those things also need to be protected. There's no right answer. It's really, again, up to everybody involved to make the best decision that they can with the materials and the circumstances that they're presented with. There is an argument to be made here that this painting should be left stabilized but not retouched as a testament to the power and destructive force of climate change. And all the stuff that Brian and I talked about with him being a maritime painter and a hurricane taking this painting, there's a powerful message there. But ultimately, for Brian and his family, this is about more than creating a statement about climate change. This is about preserving a piece of their family's history, about doing right by a family member, and making sure that the vision that captured them is also allowed to capture other people, that the power of his paintings endure, despite the fact that they survived a hurricane. Another area that is a complex situation to address is that of the signature. Now we can see here that the part of the W is missing. That piece flaked off, and we didn't find it in the bag, we didn't find it on the painting. It probably was taken by the sea. We have to retouch all of this green to make the white disappear because that's problematic. But what do we do about the W and the L? Now we know it is W.L. Dean, Walter Lofhouse Dean. It's signed on the back. We have the provenance. So we could easily just fill in that W and that L and make it complete. That's one approach, but that's not the approach that I'm comfortable taking. Specifically because we know it's Walter Dean, because we have his signature on the back, because we have all the provenance, we don't need to reinforce this signature and complete it. And by not reinforcing this signature, we effectively remove something that can be problematic in the future. A museum, a dealer, an auction house will look at this painting and they will look at it under ultraviolet light to see the retouching. And if that signature fluoresces, because the retouching will fluoresce when exposed to UV light, it can raise questions. And people start to ask, is this actually a Walter Lofhouse Dean? Because the signature is fluorescing. And so by leaving the signature partially missing, we can assure whoever looks at this painting in the future that no funny business happened around the signature and that no efforts to recreate it were made, thus eliminating a potential point of conflict with this signature. Now, again, this is my approach. It may not work for other people, but they are free to choose the approach that works for them. But I'm not going to change the way I do it because this works for me. Once all the retouching is complete, the final varnish can be applied. This is also a synthetic resin varnish, not a natural resin like Damar or shellac. It has a UV stabilizer in it so that it won't turn yellow over time, and a plasticizer to make sure it doesn't crack. It's also easily reversed, so we don't run the risk of damage to the painting. I'll brush it on and brush it around and work the surface until I have a sheen that is velvety and really, really beautiful, and one that I'm satisfied with. And then I'm done. Brian, it has been quite some time since you last saw the painting, and here it is.
It's exactly what it looked like.
That's right. All that time and we didn't do anything to it. Now, I just wanted to show you what the painting looked like when you brought it in, because this was one of the more radical transformations that we've seen in the studio. Obviously, when it came in, it had to be delivered flat because it was so perilously attached to the canvas. The paint was flaking off. The hurricane had really done a number, not only structurally and damaging both the canvas, the stretcher, the paint layer. There was a lot of loss, but it had deposited this really thick layer of grime and mold all over the painting that we had to contend with. So this is just a small reminder of where we started, but let's see where we ended up.
Wow, that's beautiful. It's like, I don't even remember that there was so much loss up here, and the family hasn't seen it like this probably in 100 years because of the smoke and soot that were on it.
Sure.
By the time I was born.
Some things that we found, I mean, there are all these really beautiful ships along the horizon line that were completely obliterated. And you know, that obviously is great to get more of the image back, but it also contextualizes the scene that was going on. It wasn't just one sailboat out. It was a breezy day. Everybody was out. You know, it was a big.
It was a real breezy day.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm just drawn to the sailboat, of course, and you know, Walter Dean had 3 sailboats in his life. He was known as a fisherman's, you know, friend, and just the detail on that. Before, it was just so flat.
Yeah.
And I was like, it couldn't be flat, but I didn't know it would be this dynamic.
We didn't have any retouching, no retouching at all in the sailboat. I mean, for a painting that went through a hurricane, I mean,
the sailboat survived.
Well, there you go, right?
How did you deal with getting the textures the way Walter Dean did it and getting the shapes and all
Magic?
Magic, yeah.
Luckily, this painting has enough impasto, that's the texture of the paint, that it allows us to kind of work and disguise the fill-in, but not so much texture that we really have to be super accurate about how we sculpt it. Or a completely smooth painting, which means that any textural difference, it becomes really problematic. This is kind of like the Goldilocks. It's just enough texture, but not too much, not too little. And so wherever we put the fill in, we had to sculpt it and give it a texture to match the brushwork. And luckily on this painting, Dean was fairly fluid in the sky and really letting the clouds kind of guide his brush. We could just kind of follow those motions and kind of in a painterly way, how I would imagine Dean was painting, use brushes and different techniques to carry those brush marks in through the fill-in medium so that there was a natural flow and it just kind of blends in.
Now, of course, this one's titled on the back. Is all of that, did that survive?
Yeah, that survived. Yeah, absolutely. All of the titling and inscription is on the back. A Breezy Day off Cape Ann by Walter L. Dean, 1890. Everything was saved. We didn't have to line the painting. We did add a strip lining on the edges because the canvas was really frayed, and this just adds some more meat and stability so that we can get it onto the stretcher. We did have to replace the keys because they were lost, but we cut them to match and put new ones in. And you know, this is the least exciting part of the painting, but it still is really important because it's as much original as possible. And of course, we have the title and his signature and the date, which is critically important.
Yep, it's the history of the painting.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Walter Dean, you know, had it in his studio still.
Yep.
So. Great. Yeah, I mean, this side just still gets me. It's, you know, it's as good as I could have dreamed of it being, not as good as I expected it to be.
So when this painting came in, you know, obviously it had suffered at the hands of a hurricane, and your role in climate change and Dean as a maritime painter and the painting being damaged, it all really was the perfect storm for this project. Obviously, we can do a lot in conservation to restore paintings when they're damaged by climate change. Not as easy, you know, writ large, but not impossible. And so that's one of the unique challenges that kind of we as the public have to face. And I think this is a really perfect example of how something that is really precious and important can be damaged by climate change, but we as people can also salvage it. We can bring it back. We can reverse that damage. Kind of maybe a large metaphor for how we exist in the world. And you know, if the proper care is given and we do it right, we can end up with something that is sustainable and beautiful and will exist for generations to come, both in paintings and our environment.